welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely riveting, dark, and lovely historical fantasy, urban fantasy with a lovely coming of age aspect that I enjoyed so much. I am so excited for this conversation. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Thanks so much, Jen. Thanks for having me. I'm Wen-yi Lee. I'm the author of the adult fantasy When They Burn the Butterfly. Jen set the scene great. It is a sapphic historical fantasy set in 1970s, newly independent post-colonial Singapore about the Chinese secret societies that were running around the city at the time. And specifically, it is about a girl gang called Red Butterfly with a fire goddess attached to them that gives them fire magic. And it is about a schoolgirl who ends up entangled with them, ends up entangled with their hot leader, and sort of goes down this path of sort of a descent into the underworld, figurative and literal, while trying to figure out her mom's murder.
It's not only a riveting fantasy story and a beautiful, beautiful coming of age story, but I learned so much about the history of Singapore while reading this in a period that I wasn't really super familiar with. And I love having an opportunity to learn about history through a really interesting and exciting perspective. Before we talk more about the book, could you tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer, perhaps like your other works? I know that this is your adult debut, so what new challenges did that present for you?
Yeah, so I've been writing. I've been one of those writers who've been writing my whole life. I was annoying everyone around me growing up by sort of foisting my stories onto them, and they were very supportive. I might not have ended up here if they weren't, but I started getting seriously into writing and thinking about publishing a few years ago, and I think it was really at the time where 10 years ago I wouldn't even have imagined that Asian fantasy could really be the thing that it is now. But I came back to writing, on the heels of Fonda Lee, on the heels of R.F. Kuang, on the heels of Zen Cho, all of these authors who I picked up and made me realize that, oh, I can write fantasy like this and I can write fantasy that feels familiar. So I started getting back into speculative fiction, started getting back into spec fic that was more from sort of where I came from and what felt closer to home. I started out in short fiction, so I've sort of really done the whole. I've done flash fiction, I've done short fiction, I have done this very long 140,000 word book. So really like span the whole gamut. And and I say all that, but my first book was a YA horror. So this was my adult debut, but my YA horror, The Dark We Know, came out 2024. I was gonna say last year. I'm still not getting the calendars right. It came out in 2024, and it's a YA horror about also queer runaway girl in who comes back to a haunted small town and has to sort of reunite with her childhood friend to confront this sort of monster that killed her friends. And then I pivoted to adult fantasy, and people often ask me where that came from. But I was just sort of working on both of them at the same time. It was during COVID. I had just come home from studying abroad, and I was really looking for reconnection. And I think both of these books were about reconnection and about grappling with home, and grappling with family, grappling with belonging in very, very different ways. But a lot of the threads run through and they really sort of encapsulate that moment in time for me, which is really beautiful, I think, to look back on. And yeah, even though When They Burn the Butterfly is technically historical fantasy, there is quite a strong thread of horror in there. So I haven't lost that route. Everything I write ends up having a little bit of horror in it, which is really fun.
Did you find that you had different strategies for writing YA versus for adults, or was it more similar perhaps than you expected?
I I think that there's some similarities just because obviously the characters are sort of similar in age. Um, Weirdly enough, the character in the adult book is younger than the character in my YA book, but I think it was very much about figuring out the voice and the complexity. When I first wrote When They Burn the Butterfly, I had pitched it to my agent as YA because, I thought it was coming of age, characters 16, 17 years old, but she read it and she said, no, it's an adult book with a teenage character. And as I sort of mined into it, I very much found that leaning into letting it be adult really just sort of unshackled the story because it is a coming of age, but it's also grappling a lot with violence. It's grappling a lot with the sort of wider political scene of postcolonialism, of the shadow of colonialism, of the shadow of occupation, of organized crime and violence in that way, and a lot of violence that is committed onto gendered bodies, on female bodies. And the dynamics that I ended up really leaning into ended up being very complex and I think quite adult. And I don't think that it's not that a teenager or a young adult couldn't appreciate it, but I think having the leeway to like take it as far as I thought the story needed to go was very freeing, and I think it's what the story needed. And in that sense, it's sort of also because it's her coming of age and writing towards an adult place for her. So I think that ended up making a lot of sense. But I think there is a lot of resonance. And I think it just sort of goes to back to the fact that, we shouldn't limit our understanding of coming of age stories to young adult because so many people are still sort of finding themselves in their 20s as technical adults. And I think that's why everyone sort of gravitates towards them.
That's so interesting, because as I was reading the book, I was thinking that it's such a cool idea to layer like a coming of age, a personal coming of age story over a kind of national coming of age story. And as you were just talking right now, I realized, we often think of like a personal coming of age as, it can be painful and sad and bittersweet and all these things, but we tend to remember them like nostalgically or sweetly or like at least with some fondness. But national coming of ages, especially in a post-colonial framework, are often violent and dramatic and eventful, but quite the opposite, And so you get to play with so many different like themes and moods by doing both at the same time. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I really do see it as a sort of parallel coming of age, for both Adeline, the main character, for the girls around her, and then also the country. In my head, there's a different version of this book where I write about the adults. But I was always drawn to the young perspective, probably because I was sort of younger and closer to that age when I started writing it. But also I think it just makes so much sense. It's I'm a huge setting person. I'm a huge character as setting and setting as character person. And those two things always have to intertwine for me. And I'm always thinking about why am I setting this character in this specific place? And for me, that's always, drawing the resonances out between them. And in this one, it was very much that a country that has just sort of, been cut loose or loosed itself, is very much like a young adult entering the world. It's trying to figure out who it is, its own identity. It's going through this massive series of transformations, especially Singapore in that time. The whole landscape was changing. It's trying to figure out who it is. It's making a lot of difficult and very drastic decisions in order to sort of secure its own future. It's sort of creating its own mythology. It's grappling with its own mythology, grappling with, the shadow of the parent, quote unquote, that it's just sort of been left from. And so it just made so much sense to me to be focusing on the sort of young, scrappy, hungry characters in this scene who are equally sort of in a precarious place and fighting for themselves and figuring out who they are, and also sort of falling through the cracks of, I think, what a traditional nation building narrative is.
Yeah, on that note, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about our protagonist, Adeline, and shaping her as a character, and maybe like how she is shaped a little bit by her historical setting. I know I've seen in a profile of you that you like to write about problem women and haunted bodies and history, and I wonder how all those things come together with your protagonist.
Yeah, I love writing Adeline. I think Adeline is one of the my favorite characters that I've ever followed. She's just such a strong character. She really announces herself to me. So Adeline is 16 going on 17, restless schoolgirl, single mom, but sort of comfortable. She comes from a comfortable place. She attends this elite Catholic school, and she has this sort of toxic codependent relationship with her mom, and it's all sort of regular except for the fact that they can both summon fire, and she's always wondered where this fire comes from, and her mom has never really given her an answer. And then her mom dies dramatically in a house fire, and she's sort of driven down this path to figure out what happened to her. And she finds out that her mom was the leader of this girl gang called Red Butterfly, and her mom was the conduit for their fire goddess. And now that she's dead, Adeline is the only tether for this fire goddess to the mortal plane, and she is the only one sort of securing the red butterfly's existence. And that puts her sort of in a complicated place. And like I get a lot of questions, I think, about why I chose to set Adeline or start Adeline off in a place that has absolutely nothing to do with the pitch of the book, which is, gangs and secret societies and the Chinatown. But it was always a beginning that I was very, very sure about. I was always very sure about the beginning, where I wanted her to start and where I wanted her to end up. And there was a lot of rewriting, finding my way through the jungle between those 2 points. But I always knew like what my start was and what my destination was, and that was my sort of beacons on either end. Um, and she starts out at this Catholic girls' school, rich girl. She's restless. She doesn't really fit in. But it was always a really important setting to me because thematically throughout the entire book, I talk so much about religion. I talk so much about imported religion specifically, and I wanted to draw attention to the fact that both these Chinese gods and these, Western gods, well, God singular, were brought in by people who were not from the region. And obviously they've become settled so much into the fabric of the country, into the fabric of the region. But neither of them were from here. And I wanted to call attention to that fact. I wanted to look at how ritual and religion sort of shapes society and shapes the way that people belong to each other and the way that people form communities. And I wanted to look at so much of this book, and so much about modernization is about class. And I wanted to look at the history of how Singapore's Chinese community significantly is so affected by how English education from missionary schools is tied to upward mobility. And hence, you get a lot of intertwining of English as a language, of Christianity as a religion, and class. And so Adeline comes from this place where she's English educated. She's not Christian, but she's sort of brought up in that environment, and she's in this all-girls school. And I wanted to also sort of draw attention to her already sort of coming from an environment that is completely outside of male structures. I think that's what's so magical about a girls' school. I came from a girls' school. And when you think about it, it's just it's so unique in the fact that, it's an entire years and years of just this sort of bubble outside of heterosexual or patriarchal sort of dynamics. And that was obviously going to set up the girl gang later on. And this girl gang exists in a very, very hyper masculine secret society gangland environment. And so thematically, that was always, what I wanted to pull out through the entire book, the tensions of religion amidst modernity, and then also just sort of where she is coming from. And obviously, it's always more fun, I think, for me, especially when you're writing like a coming of age. You want a change of state. The whole book is about transformation. The whole book is about metamorphosis. I didn't come up with the name Red Butterfly. That was the historical name of the girl gang that inspired the book. But it was, it's a thematic gift. The whole book is about transformation. The whole time period is about transformation. So I really wanted a stark contrast between where she started and where she ended up. And I just needed her to lead me there.
That is such a beautiful series of, resonances, that just happen to come together and make this so layered and lovely. It is really interesting to me that like with these girls' schools, they're so often founded um in order to maintain, sexual hierarchies or gender hierarchies, but they kind of ended up, with the potential to be very freeing spaces because it takes you outside of that system for a little while before it, plans to put you back into it. And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And Adeline, and I'm sorry I mispronounced her name before. I have a friend named Adeline, and I've had trouble overriding that in my
I
head.
get both. I've heard both, yeah.
She's such a great perspective on this world and this time period because she's so, clear-eyed. And she is so realistic in some ways, but also she's so, what's the right word for it? Being in her head is like she's very prickly, and a little more than a little bitter and snarky. And so you get to learn so much, but while also getting to experience her as a character. I hope that makes sense.
That makes so much sense. And that was so deliberate. Well, I don't know if it was deliberate. Again, I think she had really announced herself to me. I think she just sort of flowed out that way. And I just got to enjoy it for what it was and give her the space to be herself. I think with this kind of story, with someone with fire magic, someone who's a loner, someone who, again, I knew where she was going to end up. So she was never gonna be, like a shrinking violet. She was always gonna have some of that bite in her. She was always gonna have some of that fire in her. And it just sort of gets stoked along the way to not amazing ends all the time, as fire does. But yeah, she's a very opinionated character. I think she's so fun to write, and I think she really holds her own. I was really interested in sort of balances between vulnerability and precarity and also power. Obviously, these girls have more power than most girls of their station do, and that's what sort of allows them to exist in the way that they do. But they are also still very much vulnerable, and they exist in community with very vulnerable women. Um, and a lot of the book is sort of navigating those tensions and them navigating those tensions and the different girls even sort of navigating that differently and making different choices based on those circumstances. Um, yeah, I get sort of polarizing comments to Adeline, kind of expected. I think some people sort of bounce off her. She's very prickly. I've heard that word. I've gotten bitch affectionately. I like to call her. She's a little bitchy by design. And some people love it, and some people do sort of like bounce off it a little bit. But I just think that means like that she feels real and sort of realized in that way.
Yeah, I loved her because I love those kind of characters too. Because I'm like, I could use like 5% more of that energy. I would just like get more stuff done.
Yeah, it's
So,
aspirational.
yeah. Um, my last question is about your research. I was absolutely fascinated by the red butterfly and the phenomenon of these girl gangs. What kind of research did you do, and did you learn anything really surprising or fascinating?
Oh God, yeah, I could talk about the research for this book for ages, because it really is a historical fantasy that is heavy on the historical. I was very, very much concerned with the time period and with the setting at the time and what that meant for the story. I didn't want it to just be a backdrop. So that did mean I was constantly digging through the archives. I was digging through books. I became like the number one ambassador for the National Library's like newspaper archives, because the newspaper archives were just such a gift. I realize now I'm talking to a librarian. So this can be a shout out to libraries, and to archives, because I was just, when people think about historical research, a lot of the time it's, oh, what were the political movements at the time, and what were the laws being passed, or the significant historical events. And there are a lot of significant historical events. The Vietnam War was going on in the background. A lot of significant laws were being passed. But I think just one of like the most rewarding part of the research for me just ended up being like the smaller fabric of daily life. And the newspapers were so, there's a scene set in the cinema, and I would just Google, I didn't know what cinemas existed in the 70s. So I just sort of typed in, film. I looked up the film screenings from 1972 from the newspapers, and I got a whole list of all the cinemas that were on at the time. And some of my favorite scenes were just from little bits that I encountered, trawling through the newspapers. There's a scene set in People's Park, which is this shopping center that is now very old and at the time was newly built. And it was just this random, like, little excerpt about them having like a metric exhibition in this shopping center, because it was a whole thing where Singapore was trying to convert from the imperial to the metric system, to facilitate trade and to facilitate, their whole modernizing efforts. And for some reason that just stuck with me. I think that was just such a nice detail of like the backdrop of what was happening at the time. And so I like fought to keep that detail in the book. It went from like 2 pages to like, I think now it's like 2 sentences, but it's in there. And it was just so cool to like uncover all this like little details about life at the time. And I think it's that those little details that sort of ground the book. So even when I'm doing like really fantastical things with the gods and with magic, it still feels very rooted in the time period and in the history. And it was really a gift, I think, because I came into writing this wanting to sort of reconnect with my own city, with my own country, and sort of find it as an adult. And I, found all these layers of history, and I found this version of the city that my parents grew up in, that my grandparents would have seen, that no longer really exists. I think one of my favorite factoids that I discovered was that there used to be a little like island in the middle of the Singapore River, and it doesn't exist anymore because they sort of filled it in and they connected it to the mainland. But it just struck me. I was like, what do you mean there used to be an island in the middle of the river? And that was like wild to me. And so that was like another thing I fought to keep in the book. There's a whole chapter set there. The island's called Pulau Saigon. It's one of my favorite chapters. It's one of the most horror leaning chapters, I think, which is also maybe why it's one of my favorite. But yeah, it was such a gift, I think. As much as I complain about how much research I had to do, in order to get all the details right, I really think it was a rewarding process, and it was what I was like subconsciously seeking when I started writing it.
It must be so gratifying in the moment, to find something like that metric exhibition and be like, oh wow, this like perfectly encapsulates like the time period and my themes and like all these different
Exactly.
Yeah.
So many little like coincidences. I picked 1972 almost completely at random. I was looking at the 70s. I tied it to sort of a fire that happened in 1972 and just sort of built it around that. But as I was going, I just excavated like so many of these coincidences that tied in like thematically, symbolically to what I was trying to tell. The statue of the merlion, which is Singapore's sort of artificially created mythological tourism symbol. That statue went up in 1972. That makes it into the book because there's so much about symbols, there's so much about mythology. Singapore's first articles about the queer community came out in the newspapers in 1972. The first Hong Kong queer film came out in 1972. That all makes it into the book. I was just uncovering so many things, and it just felt like it was all meant to be, really.
Yeah, it's really impressive how you combine this like really great character work and fascinating world building and this just a wealth of, you know, well-earned historical research that makes it on the page, even if, it's one sentence, like it's all there informing everything. It's so lovely. Thank you for coming and talking about it with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking.
Oh, great. What's next for you? Are you working on anything right now?
I am working on the sequel to this book, which surprises some people because it does end quite decisively. But there's still some threads to follow, and I'm very keen to follow them.
Oh, great. Well, I can't wait for that. All right, listeners, you have your homework. Please check out When They Burn the Butterfly so that you can be prepared for the sequel that's in the works. I am so excited. It is
Thank you so much.
available. Oh, no problem. It's available right now as we are talking, and it will be available as you listen to this. So please check it out at your favorite bookstore or library or wherever you like to go for your books, websites, whatever. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.